I'm Megan Rosenthal.
And I'm Alexis Lee, and this is the Mayo Lab podcast. Welcome to the Mayo Lab podcast, season 2, everyone. I'm so happy you're back, and we are going to talk about counseling and therapy today in our stigma conversation. So we would like to welcome Dr. Christie Bates to the podcast. Welcome.
Welcome. I'm not doctor.
Not doctor. Well, so kind. Well, we're going to call you doctor.
You just got an upgrade.
You just got an upgrade. In my heart, you did. Well, Christie Bates, welcome to the podcast. If you'll give us a little background on who you are, how you got into this field, and kind of the work you do currently.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I'm a licensed professional counselor and a mindfulness-based spiritual director, and I'm an ordained contemplative minister. And so some people see me specifically around spirituality, mindfulness development, that kind of thing. So I'm in private practice here in Oxford. I also practice throughout Mississippi and Tennessee, which is where I sort of grew up professionally. I originally from Alabama, went to college in Memphis, ended up in Tennessee until moving down here to be closer to family a couple of years ago, or right a year before the pandemic started, actually. So, yeah. So while I was up there, I did work in a couple of different residential treatment settings, one strictly around substance addictions, and then so that was a 7-year stint, first with adolescents and their families as a family counselor, facilitated Family Week and all that. And then moved to a treatment center where we were treating, it was a trauma-focused treatment center, and so there were a number of programs that actually overlapped. So we treated intimacy disorders, eating disorders, really any sort of process or substance disorders, and that was a wonderful bit of experience. Just, so much fun to learn. So I had this role as the sort of the mindfulness lady at first, developed a contemplative program there. And over time, morphed into a trauma specialist as I got training in something called brain spotting, which is a really highly targeted mindfulness practice for addressing trauma, creative expansion, that kind of thing. And then when I knew I had a granddaughter on the way, I shifted into private practice full time because I had, by the time I left that place, I was a program director and was never not working. And so I shifted into private practice, and then a year later sort of threw up my hands and just moved down here.
As one does to Oxford.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah. So in my private practice, I do get to work with folks that are, it's interesting actually. There are a couple of groups of people. So there's folks that are in early recovery, that are stabilizing recovery. There are folks that have been in recovery for some degree of time and are ready to do a deeper level of work, of healing work. And also, there's also 2 sets around age. So I do have a lot of people, emerging adults, and then a whole group that you could say are their parents. So, it's just people at these different phases of life, yeah.
Wow. So you really see the spectrum, except for the littles.
That's right. Yeah. Sometimes, rarely I've gotten opportunity to work with littles in the room, but not very little.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Well, I'm really excited about this conversation because I think there's a lot of stigma or misconceptions around the idea of counseling and therapy. So we're going to dig in. So can we start with counseling versus therapy? Is there a difference?
Yeah. Okay. I actually made myself some little notes so my thoughts would be organized. So to me, therapy is a larger umbrella to describe all kinds of helpers. We have physical therapy, occupational therapy, mental health therapy. So, but all of these are helpers who sort of see us struggling with functioning in some way, kind of get to the root of what's happening, make a plan, and address it, right? Yeah. So that's therapy. And so in the realm of mental health therapy, it's that umbrella can be anyone from your psych nurse practitioner who prescribes meds, or your or a counselor, or a licensed clinical social worker.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And yet the counseling specifically, the licensed professional counselor role began, and I'm not super knowledgeable about this, as I just remember this from grad school, that that it began as the school counselor role.
Okay.
Was at first right. So, and then over time grew beyond that. And so in that realm of, you have people that are psychologists that maybe they've been trained from a heavy research place, and you have people maybe that are looking very much at just the internal workings of one individual. Then on the other end, and you would still call it counseling, but it would show up as therapy, or kind of those terms used interchangeably, like a licensed clinical social worker, or really any trained social worker, is going to have the lens very much on the systems that they're dealing with, schools, communities, whatever. And I find, or at least it's been my experience, that licensed professional counselor role has a bit of both. There is attention to what's going on for people inside. There's also attention to where do we need to be advocating, and and hopefully in a helpful way disrupting systems so that they support wellness instead of struggle.
Right.
Yeah.
And in this span of all, I love that continuum. That's a very good picture. So if people are kind of just entering in this space and they've heard all this and said, well, I don't even know where to start now.
Yeah.
How would you suggest people find that entry point into this realm?
As far as if somebody is looking for counseling for themselves or for their families, and let me just say to my friend, there are also licensed marriage and family therapists. So I don't want to leave them out, because that is really a beautiful specialty of its own. But so some of it is very much word of mouth. Very rarely people come to me, they have no idea I'm not a doctor. They don't. They just, somebody referred them.
Sure.
They just, I heard that lady does brain spotting, and when I first moved here, and thankfully this is not true anymore, but when I was first moved here, if you Googled brain spotting in Mississippi, there were 4 of us that came up, and only 2 of us lived in the state.
Oh, wow.
So now during the pandemic, lots of folks got, trained, and I've been making a big push to make people aware of it. But so a lot of times it's what you specialize in or what they're looking for. And they really, they just, it's like you have your credentials all over the office. Do they even see them? Who knows, But so in looking though for help for yourself, really is the word of mouth thing is probably the most helpful. Because really what you're looking for is an experience, no matter what type of grad school degree somebody has. After all this time, after all these neat innovations in the field, the thing that most predicts a successful therapy stint is the relationship. Is the relationship that you feel with your therapist or counselor or psychologist or whoever it is.
And in this word of mouth, I'm going to enter the stigma piece into this, because now I'm sure if people are talking or want to ask about it, there might be stigma around asking, or there might be stigma around talking about your counselor and who you go to or where you go to. How have you seen stigma in your years in this field? Have you seen it change, evolve? Has it gotten worse? Has it gotten better? Your experience?
In some ways, I feel like it's better. I do think there are pockets, and a small town is typically one of them, pockets where stigma is not much better than it was, I would say, when I was in college. That's just, I'm kind I still have kind of an outsider's perspective. I've only lived here a few years. But the word of mouth does seem to have to be very much word of mouth. It's anybody local who's sharing somebody's coming to them to say, hey, who do you know? It's a rare, and it has to be a relatively courageous person that's very vocal in a smaller community about what they're doing, for themselves. And but then in other places, in Nashville, it's not that big of a town, and in some ways, but there was a bit more of an attitude in Nashville that a family could have a counselor they worked with, just like you would have your family doctor. Or, there was, and of course that's not in everybody that lived there, didn't feel that way, but I'm just saying there was this understanding there. And of course, a lot of that has to do with having several universities there and several, lots of good programs there, and the treatment centers and a recovery community that is thriving. And so there is that sort of people do kind of grow into this awareness that, part of being a responsible adult is undertaking your care.
Right.
It also helps that and I think that is true in certain places, even here, that in the churches, if the people in leadership make reference to their therapist or make reference, it's just a humongous help.
Wow. Okay.
It makes so much of a difference. Yeah. And so in some ways it's better. But then also, I was considering the thing that the email you had sent a couple weeks ago, Alexis, and we were talking. The issue was about sort of like what are some of the things that we do that help, or one of the things that we do that hurt. I have to say, coming from somebody who has a lot of empathy, and my trauma healing is a focus of mine, but. I think one of the things that we've accidentally created extra stigma for families is wanting to move away from acknowledging that addiction is a process of its own and blaming all symptoms on trauma.
Interesting.
Because then people feel like if I'm bringing my kid to you for help, it's like I'm saying I've traumatized them, and of course, I mean, if you've raised kids, we all probably have had moments that we're less than nurturing.
Sure.
That's not the thing, but. That feeling of, the way I'm going to say this may sound kind of harsh, so we might keep it or not. It sells well. It and so because people have such a fear of being labeled in some way, that, and yet there is the piece about one of the things I think about in terms of families is that trauma doesn't cause addiction, but generations of family trauma keep families from responding helpfully to addiction. And so one of the things is the secrecy, right? If there's a family habit or family legacy of feeling like we have to present a certain way, then when problems arise, we're really stuck.
Right.
And so it's more that our habitual ways of responding to things can be helpful or not.
Well, and I think that's really, because we've had kind of inklings of this throughout the season so far, where we've been talking about this idea of the stigma attached to making a recognition that maybe something didn't go according to plan as a parent, right? And then you couple that with the ebbs and flows of what's quote unquote sexy or popular or catches on, and trauma. I think what you're saying is one of those things, that it's absolutely, without question, a huge issue that needs attention and concern and treatment. But when it gets popularized in the way that it has been, it now becomes something, a beast of its own, and that prevents people from actively seeking out. Because who wants to put up their hand and be like, I absolutely messed up my kids, and please go ahead and help them, right? Because nobody's going to admit that, right? But that's really what it kind of comes down to when folks are looking for those kinds of services for their families, if you're a parent or a guardian or something of that nature. And I think one of the things that you've said already that you mentioned, I kind of want to dig in on, is this idea that finding a counselor, finding somebody to assist you with whatever might be going on or assist your family with, is really about developing that relationship and that rapport, and having that kind of work through the process of whatever plan it is that everybody puts into place to address the issue that's happening. And so to destigmatize that whole, can you walk us through what that relationship building looks like from your perspective, and how do you know if somebody comes in, if I come in and talk to you, what are clues, ideas, light bulb moments that you're like, okay, yeah, this is going to work, and we're gonna be able to jive together and have this work out? Because I know that the patient probably feels that, but what do you think? What are you looking for in, like, yes, I can work with Megan, she's not going to make me crazy, or she's not going to be a problem, or I'm not the right person to work with her, whatever the case may be.
Oh, that's interesting. As far as I will say that. I mean, I'm talking over 10,000 hours of working. I mean, just maybe 12,000 hours of working with people. Yeah, you really can't always predict. Like, there's some people, they'll come in, they'll be so excited, they'll be like, "This is the most hopeful I've felt in a long time," and you will never hear from them again. Really? That can happen.
Interesting. Okay.
It does not happen very often.
Okay.
I mean, maybe in some situations it does, but
Yeah.
I think in private practice it has not. But it's and I do think that part of that, let me just say, I don't think that has anything to do with magic on my part. It is that word of mouth thing, because when they come in, right, I can feel as a therapist when they're already giving me some trust just because their friend said this was a safe person.
Sure.
Like you can really feel it.
Yeah.
Or especially, I still have colleagues that I used to work with, and I mean, I still work with them. I used to see them for lunch in Nashville. And so my friend who's a marriage and family therapist, she might send one of the folks to me for individual, online. And I know that, he really feels comfortable with Bethany. This is I've got a good, few weeks here where he can build some rapport and feel comfortable with me. And so for instance, if I misstep or if I'm as a counselor, as a therapist, if I'm too quick to make an assumption, right, he'll forgive me one or two of those.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Just because it's like, no, I trust Bethany. Bethany said this is the person that's a good fit for me.
Yeah.
So for the counselor, you really can feel that. As far as, everybody has, I think, areas that they feel that they do a really good job with. And therapists also work really hard to expand their bandwidth. Like for us, part of our training and part of our work as people is that if somebody's driving me crazy, that really is not about them. Truly, truly.
Interesting.
And, and this is in part of my contemplative training, and I wish I could remember who I was hearing. This was a retreat that somebody recorded. So I wish I could remember who the speaker was, because this teaching, I feel, was so important. But it was about dealing with difficult people. And she asked the people that were apparently in the room with her to define who was a difficult person. And they made all sorts of, guesses at what a good definition would be. And she said, that all sounds fair enough. But when it came right down to it, she said the difficult person is the person who's operating outside of our comfort zone. That's who we find difficult. And so it is important that when you're looking for a therapist, that you want either somebody who is really seasoned, because it's not that they're going to know everything. It's just they've been exposed to so many different types of situations that our comfort zone is pretty wide.
Yeah.
Right. But it doesn't mean that you can't have a brand new therapist. You might have somebody who for whatever reasons of their own life has had all kinds of exposure, and maybe they're just recently getting schooling, or maybe they're just in their mid-20s, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a depth and a breadth of people that they can respond to in a helpful way. But when someone one of the things that I want to find a way to create here in a way that's sustainable for my life and other people's lives is situations where people can do multifamily groups. When I was actually talking with a friend about this just yesterday. When I was at Cumberland Heights, the first half, it was a 4-day program back then for families. The first half of the first day was just each person sharing their story. Not the young people weren't in the room. This was just, and that even just by lunchtime, people were visibly relieved. First, visibly relieved that they weren't being told it was their fault. I mean, even as they're naming mistakes in the ways that they handled things, or just saying, I don't know what my mistake is, but I know I'm not doing something helpful.
Right.
But just hearing each other's stories, that was just the beginning, but it was an important beginning. And I do think sometimes when we only work with people in individual families or only work with people as individuals, we don't get that benefit of realizing, there's lots of families out here struggling,
right?
And these people in my group that come from all kinds of situations and backgrounds. I mean, one of the things I do want to be sure to say, because I think it's important, is that part of the genesis of stigma around having a problem of any kind is that just there's something about our human conditioning, and especially the way our societies are set up, that we consider, I'm saying in the mainstream, I know not everybody's like this, we consider ourselves successful to the degree that we can get life to go our way.
Right.
And so if we're living, for many of us, if we have a lot of privileges and life goes our way a lot of the time, if we're living in fortunate situations, then when we come up against this thing that matters so much, and here I'm thinking about parents with kids, but it can be any loved one. But the thing I care most about in life, I can't tell you how many people I've been privileged to really watch them start to grow, because this was the first thing they cared enough about to be willing to open up to their own trauma.
Right. Right.
Like going, there's something in my history that I need to look at, that I need to heal, that would allow me to be a better support, or at least not get in the way of my kids' healing. And their kid was the first thing that was most important, more important than feeling protected.
Right.
And
you just dropped like so many gems, right? Like so many gems to think about this from the perspective of being like, what a flip from I've messed up and screwed up my kid to I have to be brave enough because my kid matters so much to me to open up and do something that's going to be wildly uncomfortable and put me in a vulnerable and potentially dangerous feeling position, right? To do that. And then this idea that where we are uncomfortable is where people are pushing us outside of our comfort zone. Like, that that's going to be like in the show notes. We're going to come back to that later, because those are the things that we're really digging into for this season, to start to think about in a different way. And it's just flipping that script of I've done something wrong, to think about, okay, how can I be better in assistance to, or at least not hindering, as you said, my young person, whoever that could be, or my family member. We can broaden it out from there. How did you? I'm just going to stop saying how cool is it, but how did you get to that process? Because we've talked in this space to a lot of different people at this point, and that's the first time I've heard it kind of framed in that way. So what do you think brought you to that frame of thinking in this area?
Yeah, part of it is, and I did mean to say this at the beginning because it's not a secret, I have been involved in my own family recovery. And there's various, just for people's information, various 12-step programs around family recovery. Al-Anon, Families Anonymous, Nar-Anon, Codependence Anonymous, so all those S-Anon for families and loved ones of people with sex addiction. So these sort of family recovery programs, that's where a lot of the juice is, I find, for some of those understandings around the things that I would normally do to help a sick person actually feed this disease.
Right.
And I'm using the word disease in its hyphenated, very broad form. I'm not getting medical, although I do think there's medical components. But, or I'm told by people who know better than I that there are medical components. I'm not, making claims. But just for instance, if we have somebody who's down with the flu for a few weeks, right, or if our partner's down with the flu, if we are at all a decent person, we're going to pick up the slack for a bit, And if it gets to be 2 or 3 weeks of it, we can get kind of resentful or tired and worn down, right? But the thing is that as we're over-functioning, that gives them time to rest, and then they'll kind of start to naturally pick back up. And then we can sort of come back to more balance so that we're participating in the family in a more balanced way. When we have forms of forms of addiction and really other mental health disorders, the things that we would do to support somebody through chemotherapy, the things that we would do to support somebody through the flu or even just a 24-hour stomach virus actually just give the addicted brain more time to work on the person. And it ends up locking us into a situation where the family becomes polarized in these very rigid roles. And so that's where, in the early 80s, it's interesting. I got to attend a training years ago by a woman who was part of, in the early 80s, sort of creating this description around at the time what codependency was, and it was all in. And she kind of redid these trainings decades later, almost like an amends, right, to the community, because at that time it was just like, well, if you love somebody who is an addict or who is dealing with mental health issues, then you're codependent. That's your sickness, and you're making them sick. And I mean, it was, and this is very much a personal observation, all right, from working in treatment centers. Very often the people that tended to think like that were addicts in recovery who still struggled with understanding, like, how could somebody have loved me through that? They must have been really sick. Right? That description of codependency came from the low self-esteem of the people who were describing what codependency was.
Right.
What is more understood today is that codependency is kind of this collection of symptoms that develop under chronic developmental stress. And chronic developmental stress happens in families where there's addiction, but also families where there's chronic poverty through the generations. Where we live, we deal with the generational traumas, some of which we know, some of which we just carry in our brains and don't know, having to do with being enslaved or having enslaved other people, right? That's a big part of the trauma that goes on, that people are carrying forward, that sense of just guilty for being alive kind of feeling, I feel like I've wandered way off whatever you were asking me. But
No, this is fantastic. No.
I was hoping this episode was going to wander quite a bit because it is so vast.
It is. It is.
You are listening to the Mayo Lab podcast. For more information and resources, visit themayolab.com. Now, back to the episode.
I don't want to leave us hanging on the brain spotting piece. Because I remember when you and I first met pre-pandemic, really, that feels like ages ago, in the pre-times, that we talked about brain spotting. And that was the first time I had ever heard about it. And left that conversation going, and I did follow up and tell everybody, you need to talk to Christie because she has this really cool thing. But can you tell our listeners what it is and how it works and how you've applied it in this space? Because I think for many people, at least, if you're anything like me, you had not heard of this before I talked to you the first time.
Yeah. Well, so brain spotting is one way of looking at it is as a highly targeted mindfulness process. Now, it's not necessarily meditation related, although people sort of find themselves in that state of paying attention to their bodies and such. But to simplify a bit, so this was Dr. David Grand in around 2003 stumbled onto the fact that where we look affects what we're accessing. He was doing EMDR, which many people are more familiar with. A lot of his focus through the years was in sports psychology, and he was in New York. So creative, sports psychology. And so people would come when they would be having glitches that they shouldn't have, stage fright or whatever. But in doing, there's sort of this iconic brain spotting story about an ice skater, a figure skater, who there was a particular loop that she struggled with. And she could do things that were more difficult, like for her level of, but it was this particular loop. So they were doing some work around it, and he was using his finger to do EMDR with her, whereas in EMDR, there's a lot of this back and forth motion.
Can you explain EMDR?
Yeah, so EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Okay. If that's if that's still the correct acronym. I think they did update it at one point. But EMDR has to do with the fact that the way that our brain is designed, that bilateral stimulation of the brain, right, allows the brain to process things. That's why when we want to clear our heads about something, we go take a walk, right? That kind of thing. That's why when we're sleeping, and if we are fortunate and we have a safe place to sleep and a generally safe life, a good night's sleep, we get to that deep REM sleep. Right. That's the back and forth of the eyes, right? That allows the brain to process. So in ideal situations, that's just happening with a good night's sleep. We're just, and the thing that inspires me about this kind of work is just that recognition that we are designed to heal from everything. I mean, and not without support and not without appropriate, I mean, there's a difference between a scratch on your arm where you might need a Band-Aid and you might need to go get stitches, right? But both of those things, the healing still is, we're built to heal. And so EMDR was an innovation. It has evolved to a place of being heavily protocol based, and for some situations and some clients, that's that kind of highly structured effect is beneficial. But that's not for everybody.
Right.
And but Dr. Grand was doing work with this ice skater, and he noticed her eye just did a weird little wobble in one spot when he was doing this with her, and her eye did a weird little wobble. And he describes the experience that it was almost like he couldn't have moved it forward if he wanted to. And that has to do with really what's at the root of brain spotting is the attunement. Again, like I said in the beginning about the relationship. It's not the gimmicks and the tools that we have, it's the relationship. And he was so attuned to what was going on with her, not only emotionally, but just observing everything about her. And that eye wobbled, and so he just stayed there for about, I think, 20 minutes. And, afterward, debriefed a little bit, and she talked about just all the memories that came, right? Times that she had fallen on the ice, times that her parents had a fight in the car on the way to practice, all kinds of things, a coach yelling at her, or falls. And really, in this town, we need to be aware of it for sure, right? Kids who grow up as athletes are being traumatized all the time in terms of the brain is experiencing trauma, right? That doesn't mean it's life-threatening, but it does mean that they'll develop habits of their muscles will just like go into bracing or freezing or flinching, and that's something where the brain, for whatever reason, just hasn't processed that through.
Fascinating.
So in this scenario, they finish this session, and she calls him the next day and leaves him a message, and she says, I can do it every time. Like I can do it, like whatever the glitch was just gone. And so he and his colleagues at that time, they were like, ooh, this is really something we've stumbled onto.
Right.
And so I actually first came into contact with it through Sounds True. I don't know if you ever listened to their audiobooks. They do wonderful interviews. Tammy Simon is the woman who is out of Boulder, Colorado. And she had him on. They did, Sounds True sponsored this sort of online training. And pieces of it were live, pieces of it were not live, but, and that was right at the time, like I had given notice at my old job and was working out a month-long notice to begin the work at the trauma treatment center. And I called my friend that had recruited me over there, and I was like, let me tell you about this thing. I'm, getting this training in. And she said, yeah, I think you're going to find this is going to be a good work home for you, But so that started there.
Yeah.
And so, and then being in a scenario where I had lots of opportunities to use it. So to get back to a little more structured way of talking about it.
No, you're fine.
This aspect of where we look affects what we're accessing and affects how we feel. It's not about sight. Blind people can do brain spotting. The issue is our optic nerves that are actually a part of our brain and that are these orienting mechanisms.
Interesting.
And so with addiction in particular, there's a brain spotting practitioner, probably I'm sure she's a consultant. I know she's a trainer for sure, Roby Abels in Australia, who developed, kind of stumbled onto, so much in brain spotting is like people stumble onto things and then they develop it and they realize that with addiction, what was happening for her clients, and she was realizing what happens in addiction is that the part of the brain where somebody feels a compulsion, and really to broaden it beyond addictions, attachments, and compulsions, right? All of that craving for some kind of relief, right? We're outside of our system of feeling like I can be at ease, I can operate, and our whole system is just like screaming for something. That spot is not talking to the part of the brain that remembers consequences. That remembers, I mean, we may intellectually remember it, right? Yeah. But people don't really remember, like, last time you nagged him about drinking, that didn't actually help at all, right? And because family members also have our own compulsions and, that feeling of, I've got to do something, I'm responsible here, And so what she found was that helping people get in touch with the craving spot, helping people get in touch with the spot connected to the consequences, and helping them understand just a little more about addiction in general in her particular case, and then having people work between those two spots.
Interesting.
So that when the person had the thought to use or to act out in some way, it's not that thought might not rise, right? Anything that's really, really persistent for human beings has had some, gave some relief at some point, and the body gave a big old chemical stamp of like, remember that, do that again. That was the thing, And so the thought is going to arise at times, but now with those two spots connected, immediately with it are the consequences.
Right.
It's like, okay, that's not really an option because that's miserable.
Right.
Yeah. And then when people are doing that, they finish up with finding a spot connected to freedom. Like, what would that look like? What would that feel like in your body? So it's I'm talking a lot about the I position and all that, but really it's actually a very somatic practice. But what I love about it as a therapist is the flexibility to be able to work with people who, I had one client who said, I just used to feel like a walking head, and I've worked with her for a few years now, but she said, like when I came in here, I just felt like I was a walking head, and like the ground's down there, but she said I just wasn't, and she just didn't feel connected. There was just so much stored that she was, afraid to deal with, or really not even afraid. Just didn't have you have to have certain things have to be in place. I don't know, this is a sidebar, but not really. And I tend to speak in book recommendations. Okay.
Yeah.
So
you're our people.
There's a classic book on grief recovery called The Grief Recovery Handbook.
Okay.
And one of the things that they talk about, and I find this to be true for really people who have therapy to do, is that the things that need to be in place for a grief process to do its natural healing work are time for it, space for it, permission to feel, and a sense that somebody is there. Now, they don't have to be there in the room with you, but there has to be the feeling like I could call them up in the middle of the night if I needed to.
Right.
And so when people don't have that, and, kind of back to the thing you were asking me, Megan, a little while ago about who might be difficult to work with, if we tried to go straight into the trauma work for somebody who doesn't have a safe place, who doesn't have enough community, that can sometimes be the challenge, because sometimes people are coming in and they want to talk about the worst thing that ever happened to them. It's like, okay, we will, and let's get you situated so that that's not so flooding.
Right.
Let's get you in a situation where you have enough support. And because when we release that here, you're going to experience like this euphoria of like, ooh, freedom, right? But really, there's also this experience of like, I've been living my life as if a hand was in front of my face. And I've kind of learned to navigate like this. And then I resolved this trauma, and now everything looks different. And I don't know how to
Now what?
how to navigate anymore. And so that takes having support and grief over the time that was lost and all of that. So that I gave the example of Roby's. There also is a particular setup that Dr. Pi Fry in Boulder developed around OCD, and that just the recognition that there are 3 different parts of the brain involved in OCD, and helping people not stay. Don't stay in this. You only visit your OCD spot long enough to check how upsetting is it, right? But you don't hang out there because you don't want that to grow tentacles even further.
Right.
The thing that I like about it, though, in terms of people that struggle to feel in their bodies at first, is that because the for lack of a better word, the brain communicates directly with the therapist. And so, for instance, I can be looking for a spot when somebody's saying, well, I had this argument with so-and-so, it made me furious at the time, but I can't feel anything about it right now, So that's fine. Just think about the argument. And moving a pointer. Sometimes people use a pointer, sometimes other things. Sometimes people just gaze. But if they can't feel it for themselves, the therapist can just watch, and it's astonishing. The brain will signal you as the therapist. I mean, some of it's just reflexes like extra blinking. Some of it is, a slight, sometimes people do a flinch. I've actually also had people like nod, and they did not know they were nodding. It was just their brain went here.
Yeah.
And you just work. And then kind of in the process, that's one of those things where sometimes with trauma work for people, things can sometimes feel, quote unquote, worse before it's better because they might have to feel something for a minute before they release it.
Sure, yeah.
But there are just so many ways to help make that so much more gentle and manageable for people.
Yeah.
And so when people are working with a brain spotting therapist, the therapist is really, there's this saying in those circles, they talk about following the tail of the comet, right? That you're not here to wrangle in your client and tell them how it's going to go. It's to follow them. And yes, you might have some education for them, or you might have, but in this, it's so astonishing that if we will let the brain do its work, the client will come up with their own recommendations. Oh, I think I need to do some breath work. I hold my breath a lot. That was one that happened recently. Or, I really love my essential oils. I need to take some of those to work. That would keep, they will, when they get a chance to just angle and view things from from a different perspective, then their brain, and at one point, I don't know if there is quite a bit of research around brain spotting over the last 15 years. And I don't know if this is still true, but when I was getting started in it, one thought about what was going on was maybe an idea that somehow in this, in the eye-to-eye, that somehow that the therapist's eyes were acting as a mirror for the person's brain, right? Our brains kind of are constantly scanning our bodies for, do I need to go to the bathroom? Is there a scratch? Am I wounded? Is there a bruise to heal? Right. The brain's just doing all that. And, but it does need some technology, for lack of a better word, to see itself. Meditation, mindfulness practice is the longest known technology for that, for the mind to see itself. And brain spotting just allows people to have the support and to be able to get there quickly.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That is so cool. Isn't that so cool? Oh, gosh.
What I love about this, too, is that, I know when I first went and took counseling, it's like I just thought you laid on a couch, talk about your feelings. And, I know that that's on the movies. And
Sure.
I think there's a lot of stigma around, though, like the tools and how much is actually involved when you go to counseling. Like brain spotting, EMDR, other types of techniques. And like you don't just have to sit in a chair on a couch and talk about your feelings. But I think a lot of people still think that's what you do. And so thank you for going into that depth and like that, the back end, like the brain is so involved, our emotions, our everything, our muscles, as a former athlete, I identify with the muscle flinches and stuff that happens still. It's like there's so much that goes on in that if you haven't just even been open enough to do the work, even if it's just a little freedom you find, there's something there for everyone.
Yes. And because what we know consciously is only, if we're lucky, 6% of what our brain had, So that's the other piece is that this work is happening. And so much at the end of the session, sometimes, the therapist is like, well, I don't know why they feel better. Sometimes you can hear it. They'll share with you some big insight they had, right? And you can go, well, yeah, obviously that's going to make somebody feel better.
Yeah.
But other times you don't know what happened. And to be willing to be in that unknowingness, is the thing, is partly what makes it kind of like a, just an adventurous way to work, with people, and yet one that has a lot of built-in safety because there's a lot of the thing you were saying too that about what to expect or just how it might make people nervous. On the question about what to look for, right? If you are currently in a situation where you're pretty isolated or you just don't have a trust level to know who to ask for word of mouth recommendations. If you're looking at people's website, the word experiential would be valuable. Looking for things like it could be brain spotting or EMDR training or somatic experiencing or psychodrama or, looking for, and that does not mean that other things that are out there are not helpful. But the other things that are out there are often the things that people sort of already know about, or at least they feel like they already know about. And they kind of, and to be fair, sometimes people say, oh, yeah, I already tried that. That didn't work. It's like, oh, you tried that? Well, oh, yeah, I went for 2 sessions. It's like, okay, well, dude, you didn't try that, but okay. So, but what that tells you is, okay, that, maybe cognitive behavioral stuff, for whatever reason, shuts him down, right? So he might really love something that's more active, right? And I'm just using a he, is, it's like if he's having trouble forgiving his 14-year-old self for starting drugs, then we're going to bring an empty chair right here and let him talk to his 14-year-old and let him move over as the 14-year-old and answer, and to get out of thinking that the relief is going to come from thinking our way to it. That is one other thing that I think is so important to understand about contemplative body-based therapies and means of growth is that so often we think, we've all had those moments of like, there's like a ding and we feel better. And we mistakenly think that we had a thought and that's what gave us the relief. Right. And that's what keeps us chasing sometimes, chasing for the thought that's going to give us relief. But actually what happened is the body solved it.
Yeah.
And in that moment of relief, and then there's like the insight.
Right.
And so anything where you can, that puts you in touch with your body, we are so close to the monastery over here in Batesville where somebody can go and really just practice in the safest, kindest environment possible this experience of just allowing your body to nourish you by just being willing to give it some time and attention to just settle down and to stop striving. That when we were talking about forms of developmental stress, that striving is one of them. And that can be true, and this can be extra confusing for families that are working really hard to give their children a better childhood than they have, than they had. So that might be they're trying really hard to do it emotionally, and they read all the parenting books, and they're trying to do everything really right. Or it might be materially that they're trying to give them something better. But the whole underlying experience of striving, when you have folks that really haven't given themselves the time that they need and deserve to resolve things, there's nowhere for that to go except downhill to the next generation.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful place for us to kind of wrap it up now.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great place because you've given us so much to sit with and chew on and think about. And you've covered a ridiculous amount of ground. And I am incredibly thankful for
We're going to have to bring her back.
Yes. No, I totally agree. I totally agree.
Yeah.
But I think if we could, so far this season, we've been trying to leave folks with like things you can do today for yourself, things you can do for your family, and things you can do for your community.
Yeah.
So you've covered a lot of ground, and I think I can pull out in my head things that would fit each of those categories. But I'm going to leave the question to you. What is something we can do right now for ourselves? What can we do for our families, and what can we do for our communities?
Yeah. Let's see here. Yeah. So on the thing about the things that people can do for themselves, one of the things is there's just no reason not to have some sort of community anymore. Even if you want it to start out completely anonymous on Zoom, in your room, right? All of these, like I said, there's all of these, all kinds of family member programs. And if people have a discomfort with for whatever reason with 12-step stuff, there's Buddhist recovery circles, there are recovery circles out there. And so finding anything that you can relate to and getting plugged into that, even just like finding, like the thing you can do today is just go online at Families Anonymous or Al-Anon or something and look for where the Zoom meetings are and have an idea, even if you like, okay, here's 2 times a week that I could hop onto a Zoom meeting, right? Maybe later you'll graduate to talking to people live, but actually there's a lot of help that goes on, in those Zoom meetings. So that's one thing.
Okay.
There is a book called Conquer Your Critical Inner Voice by Dr. Robert Firestone, and some other people helped him write it. It really does a great job of helping people understand that if we are being run by that critical inner voice, we are going to pass it along to our children, even if we never say the words out loud. And so that, again, just, parents need and deserve help, right? But also sometimes helping people know, and this is also the way you're going to help your family members.
Right.
For family units, I really love the work of Harville and Gay Hendricks, the Giving the Love You Want, and Giving the Love That Heals. So that's about couples and about kids, raising kids. There's also a pair of books that Michael Bradley wrote. One is called Yes, Your Teen is Crazy, and that's for parents. And the other is Yes, Your Parents Are Crazy, and it's for teens. And it really does a lovely job of explaining to teenagers, like, hey, for a lot of people, if they have unresolved stuff, it's usually in their adolescence,
right?
Unless it's egregious stuff earlier. But and so you are not a bad kid. It's just being the age you are is what triggers your dad. That you are the age he was when this thing happened for him. So that pair of books is a great way for families to have some humor and also be able to discuss some things.
I love it. What great names.
Yeah.
I can see a lot of Christmas gifts.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Within the communities, I think for sure things like this that you all are doing, that the Mayo family is doing, that other families are doing, the Magee family, just to help bring awareness. My daughter, who Alexis knows, that helped coordinate this Overdose Awareness Day that we had at the end of August. That was really something beautiful, because a person could arrive there, and I don't care what part of the community you were from, you could find a booth that you could connect to. It was a neat, gathering. But something around, and I don't know how we would address this, but I do have to share, it was something that may be hard for people to hear, which is we have some kids that are so angry about the fact that adult drinking culture in this town is what it is. And so a kid, I really remember strongly a young man that talked to me, but I had not lived here very long, but before the pandemic. And he was experimenting with whatever he was experimenting with. And he said, I really don't want to hear it. I run into my teachers at the Grove all the time, and they're plastered. It's not just my parents.
Right.
They're so angry. And the anger comes from, I want somebody I trust to be like, how else can you deal with things? How else can you have fun?
Right.
And of course, the anger also partly comes from just that teenage judgmentalness of not understanding people's struggle. Like adults struggle, and that's why that's their way of, that's their only means of entertainment or their means of, But that somehow addressing the fact that, because it's challenging, a lot of, not just in our town, but our economy runs off of inebriation to a large degree. And so it's like we're not going to be able to help our kids very much unless we get very creative about changing that. But I have no idea how that would happen.
It's a do as I say, not do as I do type of situation, right? But I think that's a really key observation. And I mean, if only we had the answer to it today. But it's certainly something worth our considering and thinking harder on, right? Because if we see it through that lens, it does seem absolutely from that young man's perspective, like these people don't have a leg to stand on. It's kind of tricky. Like, how do you justify that, right? So I totally get it. But I think we have an amazing group of listeners. And so let's start thinking about that and having conversations, continuing this conversation in that space to figure out what we want, what we value, and aligning what we say with what we do, right? And I think that's where we have so many gems from this episode. I'm just so excited. And we are absolutely going to have you back again. Thank you so much for making the time for us this afternoon. We're incredibly appreciative of it and all of your wisdom and your ideas and keeping us practical, things we can do, books we can pick up, stuff we can start thinking about. It's just been a real pleasure chatting with you again. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Mayo Lab Podcast. The Mayo Lab Podcast is produced by Dr. Natasha Jeter, Dr. Megan Rosenthal, Alexis Lee, Slade Lewis, and Hannah Finch. This podcast was recorded at Broadcast Studio in Oxford, Mississippi. The show was mixed and mastered by Clay Jones, and our original music was composed by Slade Lewis. The Mayo Lab Podcast is brought to you by the William Magee Institute for Student Wellbeing. For more information on the Mayo Lab Podcast, head over to themayolab.com and follow us on social media at the Mayo Lab. If you enjoyed listening to the Mayo Lab Podcast, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Dr. Megan Rosenthal, Alexis Lee, and their guests on the show. This podcast is not intended to be a substitute for the medical advice of a licensed counselor or physician. The listener should consult with their mental health professional in any matters relating to his or her health or the health of a child.